A summer evening in Pittsburgh. The crowd roars inside PNC Park, the smell of popcorn and pretzels drifting through the air. A father and his 7-year-old son stand in line, waiting for a snack before the first pitch. The boy, wearing a yellow cap too big for his head, clutches a baseball with the kind of pride only a kid can have. The father turns for just a moment, to grab napkins, to hand over a few bills, and when he looks back, his son is gone. Zoe scream. No panic. Just gone. Within minutes, security locked down the stadium. Within hours, helicopters scoured the skyline. And within days, the nation knew his face. Yet no body was found, no ransom note, no answers. For 17 years, silence hung heavy. Until one night in a homeless shelter, a retired officer-turned-volunteer spotted a man who looked strangely familiar, a face he remembered from a poster nearly 2 decades old. But was this really the boy who vanished? And if so, where had he been all this time? If this story already has you leaning forward, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps us bring more documentaries like this to you. Subscribe if you love deep human stories that stick with you long after the video ends. And hey, share this one with a friend who enjoys a good mystery, because this case is about to take some wild turns. The air inside PNC Park that July evening buzzed with anticipation. Families streamed through the gates, clutching tickets and foam fingers, the scent of hot dogs drifting upward while the sky shifted from orange to deepening blue. David Carter and his son Michael walked shoulder to shoulder through the crowd. Michael's oversized yellow cap nearly covered his ears, and he clutched a scuffed baseball like it was treasure, smiling with a missing-tooth grin. The stadium's energy felt alive. Vendors shouted about peanuts, teenagers posed for pictures, and kids raced past holding souvenir bats. Amid the noise, David leaned down and said, "Stay close, champ. Don't wander too far." They stopped at a concession stand. Michael tugged at his father's sleeve, pointing toward the pretzels twisting on a metal rack. David chuckled, ruffled his son's hair, and ordered a soda, careful not to lose sight of the little figure beside him. For just a second, David turned his back. He grabbed napkins, reached for his wallet, handed over a few crumpled bills. When he turned again, his son was gone. No sound, no warning, just absence. At first, David thought Michael had ducked behind him, maybe distracted by a display of hats. But the boy wasn't there. His heart quickened, his eyes darting frantically through the sea of strangers around him. "Michael?" His voice cut through the noise, rising with panic. He pushed past a family, scanning rows of legs, searching for the familiar cap. The yellow brim was gone, swallowed by the shifting tide of bodies. Within minutes, concession workers noticed his distress. Security guards rushed over, radios crackling with clipped commands. "We've got a missing child, male, 7 years old." The words echoed in David's mind like a nightmare he couldn't escape. The game continued above them, cheers bursting as the first pitch soared. But beneath the stands, chaos swelled. Security locked the exits, ushers blocked stairwells, and a father screamed his son's name over the roar of thousands. Reporters soon caught wind of the unfolding tragedy. Cameramen gathered outside the stadium gates, their lenses aimed at tear-streaked faces. By midnight, news anchors across the country repeated the same haunting phrase: "A boy lost at a ball game." Helicopters combed the Pittsburgh skyline, searchlights cutting across rooftops. Police dogs traced scents through alleys. Volunteers canvassed neighborhoods. Flyers stamped with Michael's smile papered telephone poles and diner windows. Yet no trace appeared. Not a shoe, not a clue. David refused to leave the stadium that night. While officers urged him home, he lingered at the pretzel stand, staring at the space where his son had stood minutes before, whispering Michael's name like a prayer. Every corner was checked, bathrooms searched, storage closets opened. Yet the child had evaporated. No witnesses saw him leave. No camera caught his exit. It was as if the crowd itself had swallowed him whole. By dawn, the city felt smaller, suffocating under dread. Coffee shops buzzed with whispered theories. Strangers studied every child's face, wondering if it matched the missing posters. Fear crawled under the skin of Pittsburgh like a second shadow. Authorities called it one of the most baffling disappearances in the city's history. Experts argued about trafficking rings, abductions, runaways, but David clung to the simplest, most unbearable truth. His son had been there, and then he wasn't. Michael's room back home remained untouched, his bed unmade, his baseball cards scattered, his drawings taped to the wall. David sat in the doorway night after night, hoping his son might somehow walk back through it. The case captured national attention. America's Most Wanted aired his photograph. Families mailed letters of sympathy. Strangers lit candles. And still, no ransom note arrived, no confession surfaced, no leads brought the boy closer to home. Seasons passed, players changed, stadium lights flickered on for new games, new crowds, new laughter. But David returned each year to that same entrance, holding the same photo, asking the same unbearable question: where did his boy go? The city moved forward, but David couldn't. He was a man anchored in time, haunted by a single moment. And while the world forgot, he kept searching, refusing to believe silence was the final answer. The days after Michael's disappearance stretched into weeks. David Carter barely slept, pacing his home like a restless ghost. He replayed every second of that night, searching for the detail that might explain everything. Detectives knocked on his door daily, notebooks open, pens ready. They asked the same questions again and again, hoping consistency would crack. But David's answers never changed. He looked away, turned back, and Michael was gone. Friends tried to console him, dropping off meals, leaving notes, offering prayers. David nodded politely, but inside he bristled. What good were casseroles or sympathy when his son was missing from the dinner table? The media circus burned hot, then cold. At first, headlines blazed with outrage. Child snatched at stadium. Talk shows debated security failures. But as months passed, coverage waned, and the nation's attention drifted elsewhere. David refused to drift. He taped Michael's photo to his car dashboard. He handed flyers to strangers at gas stations. He returned to PNC Park repeatedly, pointing at the exact spot where his son vanished. Each anniversary of that night became a ritual. David stood at the stadium gates with candles and posters. Fans walked past with jerseys and beer, glancing at him like he was a relic from another time. His house froze in time, too. Michael's room remained untouched. The baseball glove sat on the shelf, the crooked crayon drawings curled on the wall. Dust settled on everything except David's grief. Detectives cycled through the case. New recruits skimmed the file. Veterans shrugged. Some cases never break, they admitted. But David's voice shook with defiance whenever he heard it. Not mine. Not my son. I'll never stop. Neighbors whispered about obsession. They saw him scouring dumpsters at dawn, asking strangers if they'd seen his boy. They called him broken. But David only saw himself as a father unwilling to surrender. 17 years is an eternity when measured in hope. Birthdays passed without candles. Holidays passed without laughter. The phone never rang with good news. Yet David kept one line open, waiting for a voice that never came. He joined online forums for missing children, clinging to stories of miraculous reunions. A teenager found after a decade. A man recognized by a scar. Each headline reignited his belief that one day Michael would return. Time aged him cruelly. His hair whitened, his hands trembled, but his eyes burned with the same determination. Reporters who checked in described him as weathered but unbroken, still chasing a shadow most had forgotten. The world saw him as tragic. He saw himself as accountable. I looked away, he repeated endlessly. Guilt weighed heavier than time. It carved into him, a wound that never closed, only deepened. Every year he filed formal requests to reopen the case. Every year officials humored him, then closed the file again. He kept copies of every denial, stacked neatly, proof of a system that gave up. In his private moments, David replayed Michael's laugh. The sound haunted him more than silence. He carried his son's baseball in his coat pocket, rolling it between his fingers whenever despair threatened to drown him. He talked to strangers about his son, as if speaking kept him alive. Taxi drivers, cashiers, waiters, all heard the story. Most nodded awkwardly, unsure what to say, while David carried on regardless. Through all the passing years, he never allowed the image of his son to age in his mind. Michael was forever 7, forever smiling with a missing tooth, forever wearing that too big yellow cap. And though the world moved forward, David remained behind. He was a man anchored in silence, holding on to a promise unspoken, that no matter how long it took, he would not stop searching. In Columbus, Ohio, miles from Pittsburgh and years from that fateful night, a quiet homeless shelter provided meals and cots for men who had nowhere else to go. Among them, a stranger appeared. He called himself Daniel. Withdrawn, gaunt, eyes hollow yet sharp in fleeting glances. He avoided conversation, ate little, and kept to himself. Still, there was something unsettling about him, something unfinished, like a puzzle missing pieces. Elliot Ramos, a retired officer volunteering at the shelter, noticed immediately. Years on the force had trained him to trust instinct, and instinct told him this man's silence hid something deeper than mere hardship. One evening, Elliot spotted Daniel fumbling with an object in his coat pocket. When the fabric slipped, a tattered yellow baseball cap peeked through, faded, but unmistakably treasured, carried like an heirloom. That sight froze Elliot. Memories surged of a poster from years ago, the face of a boy gone missing, wearing that very color of cap. Could it be coincidence, or something far heavier? Elliot approached gently, kneeling beside Daniel's cot. "Where are you from, son?" he asked softly. Daniel didn't look up. His voice, barely a whisper, answered, "I used to be someone else." The words chilled Elliot. They weren't evasive. They were confessional, like fragments slipping from a fractured memory. Elliot's pulse quickened. After decades in law enforcement, he knew this was no ordinary drifter's remark. Upstairs, in a small office above the shelter's kitchen, Elliot dug through an old file he had kept from 2006, a bulletin with Michael Carter's picture, the boy who vanished 17 years earlier. Unfolding the paper beside a dim desk lamp, Elliot compared the photo to Daniel's face. Older, sharper, but the eyes identical. And above the left brow, faint but certain, the same small scar. Elliot's chest tightened. He stepped into the hall, staring back at Daniel curled in the corner, the yellow cap clutched tightly. The resemblance wasn't just familiar, it was undeniable. A ghost made flesh. Rain pattered outside as Elliot reached for the shelter's landline. His hand trembled. When the voice on the other end answered, Elliot whispered words he never thought he'd say. "I think I've found your son." 200 miles away, David Carter sat at his kitchen table, coffee steaming in his hand. When the call came, his grip faltered, and the mug shattered against the floor in disbelief. "Say that again," David demanded, his voice breaking. Elliot repeated it carefully, certain now the man in their shelter might be Michael Carter. The silence that followed carried 17 years of grief crashing into hope. That night, Daniel slept uneasily. Shadows stirred across his dreams, fragments of a past he could never fully piece together. A man's voice echoing, "Champ," an elevator ride, a baseball glove, flashes without clarity. Elliot lingered by the doorway, watching him. He wasn't just seeing a stranger anymore. He was looking at a living question. A missing boy, possibly grown into a man who didn't know himself. The discovery brought no instant joy, only heavier questions. If Daniel truly was Michael Carter, where had he been for nearly 2 decades? Why didn't he remember? Or worse, what if he did? Elliot's instincts screamed this was only the beginning. He tightened his grip around the cap he'd borrowed briefly from Daniel's pocket, turning it over until he saw faded ink beneath the brim. Mikey C. The world believed Michael Carter was gone. Yet here he was, alive, breathing, but buried under a name not his own. And with that revelation came a storm no one was prepared to face. When social workers found him, he gave the name Daniel. It wasn't his, but it was the only one that surfaced in his foggy mind. They added Jameson after the street where he stood. From that moment, Daniel became a ghost boy. No trail, no birth records, no birthday. Just a name stitched together by strangers who couldn't place him anywhere except the foster system. Foster homes blurred together. Some offered kindness, some indifference, and one carried shadows he refused to revisit. He learned to keep quiet, to never flinch, to avoid closed doors and clinking glass bottles. By age 16, Daniel vanished again, this time by choice. He ran from the system, slipping into the cracks of cities, surviving on couches, odd jobs and shelters, always drifting, always forgotten once he left the room. Yet fragments of another life haunted him. A man's voice calling him champ, the mechanical hum of an elevator, a toy dinosaur buried under soil. Memories flickered like static, too faint to grasp completely. Elliot Ramos noticed the fracture. One evening, Daniel froze before a television in the shelter's community room. An old replay of a Pirates game flickered across the screen, and his expression twisted into something indescribable. It wasn't nostalgia or joy. It was a look of pain wrapped in longing, like staring at a house you'd once lived in but barely remembered. Elliot recognized it instantly, the look of loss. The next day, Elliot left an old 2006 Pirates yearbook on the break room table. Hours later, he watched Daniel leaf through its pages slowly, stopping at a photo of kids lined up beside players. There he was, a small boy in a yellow cap, grinning awkwardly. Daniel's hand trembled as he touched the image. He didn't speak, but his silence carried more truth than words ever could. That night, Elliot retrieved Michael Carter's missing person flyer again. He studied the scar above the brow, the slope of the eyebrows, the unmistakable eyes. Then he looked at Daniel and knew with absolute certainty. When Elliot finally whispered the name Michael Carter, Daniel's body stiffened. His breath caught. His lips parted as though the syllables triggered something hidden. "That sounds like someone I used to be," he whispered. David Carter, meanwhile, aged decades in a moment when he heard the name. White-haired and trembling, he carried 17 years of hope. The possibility his son was alive fractured him with both joy and dread. Their meeting came quietly in a chapel behind the shelter. No cameras, no reporters. Just a father entering a room where a man sat, curled like a boy bracing for punishment, unsure of everything. When Daniel finally looked up, their eyes met. No cinematic embrace followed, only silence, raw and unbearable. Then David placed something on the table, a faded plastic dinosaur dug from the soil outside their old house. Daniel stared at it, tears breaking through years of steel. He didn't remember planting it, but he remembered holding it once. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry. Still, questions festered. Why didn't he remember more? Why did fragments collide with contradictions? Every memory was suspect. Every scar carried 2 possible stories. Truth, for Daniel, had become a labyrinth with shifting walls. The world believed a miracle had occurred. But inside Daniel's fractured mind, the miracle was far from complete. He wasn't only rediscovering who he was uncovering the shadows of what had been done to him. Daniel agreed to visit Pittsburgh, though not without hesitation. The city that once held his childhood felt foreign now, a place of shadows where joy had been replaced by silence, suspicion, and unearthed ghosts. Instead of staying at the old house, he checked into a modest motel near the Monongahela River. The carpet smelled faintly of mildew, the lamp flickered, but anonymity felt safer than familiarity. That first night, Daniel didn't unpack. He lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, gripping the plastic dinosaur his father had returned. He pressed it so tightly, it imprinted his palm. The next day, he walked Fairview Street. His childhood home stood quiet, the porch swing gone, the yard tree taller. Windows, once glowing with warmth, were now boarded, pulsing with an eerie kind of silence. As he lingered, an elderly neighbor shuffled from his porch. Squinting, he called out, "Daniel, that you?" Confused, Daniel stepped closer. The man introduced himself as Mark, someone who once babysat him on weekends. Mark remembered him not as the smiling boy from posters, but as a quiet child, always hiding. "That missing poster? Didn't look like you. You never smiled wide like that," Mark said solemnly. Daniel's chest tightened. Mark went further. On the night of his disappearance, he'd glimpsed him in an alley behind the butcher shop. He called out, but Daniel ran, disappearing into darkness before police arrived. Stunned, Daniel asked, "Did you tell anyone?" Mark nodded sadly. "Of course. But they dismissed me, said I was old, confused. They never believed what I saw." The words unsettled everything Daniel thought he knew. Back at the motel, he searched online for information about that butcher shop. An old article appeared. The owner, Richard Kinland, had been arrested in 2006 for unrelated child abuse charges. The shop closed soon after. Daniel's head pounded. His scar throbbed. Flashes surfaced. Concrete steps, a damp room, the smell of raw meat, a voice whispering, "Be quiet." The memories cut jagged, leaving him trembling on the motel floor. The following morning, he confronted David. "Who was Richard Kinland?" he asked. His father froze, face pale. "A monster," David muttered. "We didn't know until later. He lived nearby, owned the butcher shop." Daniel pressed harder. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" David's pause lasted too long, his tone too rehearsed. "Because we thought he took you." The words rang hollow, stirring suspicion that sliced deeper than before. For Daniel, the scar above his brow no longer matched the driveway fall story his father told. His fragments recalled something different. A basement, a fall, a sharp corner, and pain that never healed. Doubts grew heavier. What else had been concealed? Why did David's answers always feel one step too neat, one layer too polished? Truth, once fragile, now twisted like glass cracking under pressure. As the days passed, silence between them widened. Daniel visited familiar streets at night, letting the city's shadows swallow him whole. Each step revealed a past blurred by lies, shaped by someone else's story. At dawn, he returned to the butcher shop lot. Weeds consumed the cracked foundation, but among the rubble he spotted a rusted metal hatch. He pulled it open, stairs yawning downward into darkness. Daniel descended slowly, each breath colder than the last. Chains dangled from damp walls. Faint chalk drawings scarred the concrete. A stick figure beside a dinosaur. His knees buckled. Memories collided violently with truth. He collapsed, gasping, as the final realization struck. The basement had been his prison. The scar had been earned there. And behind every silence, every unanswered question, lurked a story his father hadn't told. The metal hatch screeched as Daniel forced it open, rust flaking against his hands. A sour chill rushed upward from the darkness below, carrying with it the stale smell of damp concrete and rot. He descended slowly, each step echoing in the hollow chamber. His breath fogged in the cold. The deeper he went, The heavier the silence pressed, until the night above seemed impossibly distant. At the bottom, a small room stretched before him. Its walls were scarred with rust stains, damp patches, and strange markings. Chains clinked faintly where they dangled, as though disturbed by invisible movement. Daniel's flashlight beam quivered across the floor. There, faintly etched into the concrete, lay chalk drawings. A stick figure, a dinosaur beside it. His stomach knotted. His own childhood had left these markings behind. The sight unlocked memories. A man's voice barking, "Don't scream!" The clang of footsteps above, the metallic taste of fear. He remembered curling into corners, clutching his knees, waiting for hours in the suffocating dark. His scar throbbed again. The basement whispered reminders of where it came from. Not a driveway fall, but a tumble against stone when he tried to run, before rough hands dragged him back. Daniel collapsed to his knees. His chest heaved. Memories returned not as stories, but as sensations. The damp sting on his skin, the smell of raw meat, the echo of laughter that wasn't kind. He clawed at the dirt floor, pulling loose a rusted padlock buried shallowly. His hands bled, but he clutched it tightly, certain this object had once sealed his world shut from the outside. Stumbling upward into dawn, he gasped for air. The lot around the butcher shop seemed silent, but his eyes caught a figure in a gray coat standing at the edge, watching, then disappearing into shadow. Daniel's paranoia swelled. The motel no longer felt safe. He set the padlock on the nightstand, beside the dinosaur and old photos. He stared at it for hours, as if daring it to speak. Elliot found him pale, trembling. "You haven't been back to the shelter," he said carefully. Daniel gestured toward the padlock. "Something's not right. My memories don't match the story. The truth doesn't add up." Elliot leaned closer. "What story?" Daniel whispered. "The one my father tells. The one the news told. The one I'm supposed to believe. But what if I wasn't lost? What if I was hidden?" Together they began digging through archives. Elliot reached old contacts. Daniel scoured maps, timelines, newspaper clippings. Connections surfaced. Names, sightings, and forgotten leads. A network of shadows began emerging, larger and darker than expected. Every discovery chipped at the fragile trust between Daniel and his father. The butcher, the gray-coated man, the scar, the lies, all pointed toward truths far uglier than mere disappearance. Daniel returned to the lot again, this time at dawn. He stood by the hatch, staring downward. The basement was empty now, but its silence screamed louder than any confession he'd heard. He touched the wall where the dinosaur drawing remained faintly visible. His fingers trembled, as if part of him was still that boy, waiting for rescue that never came. A boy betrayed by silence. The basement hadn't just buried his childhood, it buried the truth. And now, standing above it 17 years later, Daniel realized the past hadn't disappeared. It had been waiting for him all along. The shadows of that room followed him back into the waking world. Every corner seemed darker, every silence louder. The basement wasn't only beneath the butcher shop. It was inside him, carried everywhere he went. Daniel returned from the basement hollow-eyed, carrying the weight of memories he wished weren't his. Yet questions pressed harder than grief. One truth remained unresolved. His father knew more than he admitted. He confronted David directly one morning, voice trembling yet sharp. Who was Kinland really? Why did our lives brush his? David's face drained of color, his pause long enough to betray hesitation. He was a monster, David muttered. We didn't know until later. The answer felt clipped, too neat. Daniel studied him. Silence stretched, trust cracked, suspicion swelling like poison beneath skin that once felt safe. Fragments aligned cruelly. The scar, the chalk drawings, the freezer memory whispered by a foster parent. Each thread wound back toward his father, tangling into a knot he couldn't ignore anymore. Elliot urged caution, but Daniel refused restraint. "The lies need light," he whispered. He confronted David again, pressing harder. "Did you give me away? Did you hand me over to them?" David flinched at the accusation, but his silence screamed louder than denial. Finally, he whispered, "I thought it was temporary. Just a scare tactic. They promised you'd come back." His voice fractured. Daniel's world tilted. The ground beneath him felt as unstable as that rusted hatch. His father hadn't been powerless. He had chosen. He had gambled with his own son's life. "Debts," David finally admitted. His eyes brimmed with shame. "I owed men money. They threatened us. They said this was the way. Just a few days. I believed them. I was wrong." Daniel recoiled as if struck. Every year spent searching suddenly twisted into betrayal. His father wasn't simply a grieving man. He was the reason silence lasted 17 years. The wound deepened beyond repair. Anger erupted. "You let me vanish!" Daniel shouted. "You let Mom—" But the word caught. There was no mother in this rewritten life, only absence replaced by fatherly deceit. The fury remained regardless. David crumbled into sobs, collapsing under the weight of confession. "I tried to fix it. I searched too. I never stopped." But his tears couldn't cleanse the truth. The damage was irreversible. For Daniel, forgiveness felt impossible. He had lived nameless, homeless, forgotten. Not by accident, but by choice his father made. That truth struck harder than any hand in that basement ever had. News of the revelation spread cautiously through investigators. Files reopened, case notes re-examined. The word trafficking surfaced, whispered like poison. Suddenly, the disappearance was no longer tragedy alone. It was conspiracy, fueled by debt and betrayal. Elliot stood by Daniel, his presence steady as stone. "You're not responsible," he said quietly. But Daniel felt poisoned by his father's sins, carrying guilt like a second skin he couldn't peel away. The man who once seemed broken by loss now appeared corrupted by secrecy. His grief was real, but his hands weren't clean. He hadn't just failed to protect, he had orchestrated the fall. Daniel sat alone that night, staring at the dinosaur in his palm. "Planted by Mikey. It will come back." The words mocked him now. His father had buried more than toys beneath that tree. Betrayal reshaped him. He wasn't just a survivor of abduction. He was a son abandoned by the man meant to shield him. And that realization carved scars deeper than the basement walls ever could. The truth was devastating, but undeniable. David Carter wasn't merely a victim of circumstance. He was the beginning of it all. And for Daniel, knowing that meant the life he rebuilt could never be the same. The storm of revelations left Daniel reeling, but silence no longer imprisoned him. He knew who he was. Michael Carter. A boy once vanished, now a man living in the shadow of survival. The media called him a miracle, a headline, a story to inspire evening news anchors. But Daniel didn't feel like a miracle. He felt hollow, carrying 17 years of broken silence inside. Reporters swarmed his motel, cameras flashing through curtains, microphones pressed to glass. They wanted sound bites. They wanted closure. Daniel ignored them all. The world could have its story. He wanted something more. Peace. He moved into a small guest room at Elliot's house. Curtains drawn, lights dim. He stayed quiet for weeks. Sometimes staring at the wall, sometimes holding the dinosaur, sometimes wondering if healing was possible. Elliot reminded him gently, "You're here now. That's enough." But Daniel questioned everything. If survival was enough, why did his chest still ache? Why did every silence feel like the basement breathing again? Still, he tried. He walked neighborhoods, unnoticed, blending among strangers. Coffee shops, buses, crowded parks. Spaces once suffocating now felt oddly comforting. He wasn't the missing boy here. He was just another man. He attended survivor groups quietly at first, listening as others shared stories: abduction, trafficking, abandonment. Each testimony stitched threads into his own fractured fabric. One evening, he finally spoke. His voice trembled but held steady. "My name was Mikey Carter. For years, I didn't have a name. I thought that meant I didn't matter, but I do. We all do. Because we survived." The room fell silent, then warm. He visited his father once more at the federal facility. David sat small, withered by guilt. Their eyes locked through glass. Daniel's voice shook as he said, "You don't get to be sorry." Walking out, Daniel realized forgiveness wasn't for his father. It was for himself. To drop the weight, not to excuse betrayal. Healing, he learned, wasn't about forgetting, but choosing what not to carry. When autumn came, he visited his mother's grave. In this retelling, not a mother but a marker for lost family. He placed the silver locket he'd been given, whispering, "I'm still here. I'll keep going." He returned to PNC Park one afternoon. Empty seats echoing corridors. Standing where his father once lost him, he whispered, "I'm not that boy anymore." The silence answered back, but this time it didn't haunt him. Back home, he began writing. Not for reporters, not for books, just pages of memory. The sound of chalk scratching walls, the metallic taste of fear, the strange tenderness of survival against impossible odds. Elliot encouraged him. "Sometimes writing is healing." Daniel didn't know yet if it was. But words spilled anyway, forming fragments of identity, fragments of grief, fragments of the boy he once was, and the man he'd become. He learned to smile again, small, unplanned smiles that felt like stolen sunlight. Not joy, not yet, but something close. Something that promised life beyond trauma wasn't only possible, but waiting. Years of silence hadn't erased him. 17 years hadn't defined him. He was more than disappearance, more than betrayal, more than scars. He was alive, and that fact alone was defiance against everything that tried to erase him. One evening, sitting on Elliot's porch, he closed his journal after writing a single line. The boy went missing, but the man found him. For the first time, the words felt true. As twilight settled, Daniel looked out over the city. Children laughed somewhere distant. A guitar strummed faintly. Life moved, and in that moment, for the first time in 17 years, he felt like he belonged.